This is the 9th video in a series on how to do a cybersecurity risk assessment and forms part of the first stage of the GRC lifecycle, assess risk. In the previous video, we worked out the risk ratings if there were no controls in place and if all recommended controls were in place. Now in this video, we will take the main things we found in our risk assessment and use this to write the executive summary. Some of the people we share our report with, both at our own company and at the client, will not necessarily have the time or interest to read our entire report. You do not want to do all of this work on your report and then not get any feedback or deliver any value, because for some people, reading the whole report is just too hard. Now that we've worked out all the risks and the controls, we can summarize them concisely. The point of the executive summary is to take the whole report and summarize it in a page or two. It's generally intended to be for business executives, directors, upper management, people like this, but it can be useful for anyone, as it allows someone to get an overview of what you found, such that they can then read the whole report in its entirety, looking into the details if they want to. But for some people, they just want to get a general idea and they trust that you have the details and the evidence in the report to back up your summary. They just want to get the general idea so they can then do something useful with that. And very importantly, the executive summary will be a big focus when the client reviews the report. That's the first section they read, and they're definitely going to be asking you questions about that. So it needs to accurately indicate what the rest of the report is about and be written in a very digestible, understandable way, considering that the audience may not have a huge technical understanding, but they may be very important decision makers. And so they need to have the core ideas of the report communicated to them effectively in a language that they understand. If we look at the risk assessment document template, in the executive summary section, we start off with an overview, which is almost like a summary of a summary in some ways. In previous videos, I filled in a little bit of this already. I put in the name of the company that we're working for. I put in the client name, and I gave a reason for why the risk assessment was being done. Like I said at the beginning of this video series, this particular format that I'm using is not the only way to do it. This reflects experience that I have doing reports in real life. The most important thing is that we keep in mind the audience for this are people who want to get an idea of the report without reading the whole thing. They do not necessarily know the background to CTL, the client in this case, or why the report is being done. So for the second area here, after a single sentence describing why we've done the assessment, we're then looking at listing out the major scope items in the assessment. So in the case of CTL, we're looking at their proprietary digital logistics platform that's central to their business processes. Also the AWS environment hosting the DLP, because the digital logistics platform depends on other cloud services and tools and things like this to work properly. We also need to consider these business process dependencies. And then we're also looking at the broader general security practices and policies of CTL. Typically, any project that you do will have a specific scope. And so you can summarize this here or list it out if the scope isn't very big, but we're just making it clear to anyone reading the report what we actually looked at as part of the assessment. Next, we need to look at the overall risk rating for the company. In this case, I'm saying for CTL, it was high because we did find a lot of risks. If we quickly scroll down to our risk table, we can see that we do have a lot of high, very high risks. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we consider CTL as having a high risk rating. We can now remove this example section and move on to key findings and recommendations. The idea in this section is that we need to go through our risks and think about what are some themes. There are certain types of risks, certain types of problems that you're probably going to find through different risks. It's just that those problems or issues appear in different ways, maybe, but it's the same underlying problem. So if we look at this format here, the idea is we start out with the title, such as Digital Logistics Platform Availability. We then describe a vulnerability or problem, and if that problem was exploited, these were the negative consequences. So here we describe how the DLP is critical to CTL operations due to its involvement in many business functions. If the DLP were compromised or unavailable, then we describe the consequences. CTL business operations could be severely disrupted. The company may not be able to service customers or suppliers as expected, leading to lost revenue, unfulfilled contracts, and reputation damage. So the idea here is we're taking this core idea of the DLP is not available and then trying to describe to people who lead the company, who make decisions, what would happen if this risk were to occur, if this problem were to happen, and then try to give them some more specific details for consequences so that when they read this, they can then understand how this directly impacts things that they are responsible for. If people running the business are supposed to make sure that the business has revenue, that it's profitable, that they can service their customers, that they can fulfill their contracts, and that they have a good reputation. If you're then saying that you're going to have problems in all these areas, if there is an issue with DLP availability, then it's more understandable for these people who are responsible for these different areas. Below that, we then list out some recommendations to try and fix this. So in this case, for DLP availability, we can look at improving the security in the infrastructure through hardening, making sure they do regular penetration testing, making sure they have redundancy. So if there is some kind of issue, you have the ability to launch another copy of the DLP, making sure the infrastructure can scale up if they need more computing power to enable the servicing of all the customers, and making sure that data is backed up. So if things are lost, if things are accidentally overwritten, if things are deliberately encrypted using ransomware, whatever happens, since this is a critical platform, we need to make sure data associated with it is backed up. We also need to make sure that we have secure coding practices and software development lifecycle to ensure that we don't have a multitude of issues that could occur if things were not coded properly, if there were errors, if there were vulnerabilities this could lead to many different issues. So we need to make sure that the development of the DLP is done properly. And then more specifically to redundancy, we need to make sure that there is a plan in place that is tested regularly so people are familiar with it to ensure that there is incident response. People know what to do. They know how to identify an incident, who to escalate to, when to escalate. There's business continuity. So business processes can continue to a reasonable extent while the DLP is being fixed when you execute the disaster recovery plan to fix any technical problems. So if we delete this example section, well, the second key finding, we're looking at unauthorized or misused access to confidential data. We first describe how the DLP and other platforms used by CTO handle confidential information, including freight carrier drivers' licenses, customer and supplier personal contact details, shipment contents information, delivery locations, financial account information, customs clearance documentation. These are the types of confidential information handled by the company, essentially, not just the DLP. Then we talk about how if this information was accessed by unauthorized personnel or access was misused by authorized personnel, we talk about the potential consequences, including reputational damage, revenue loss, financial penalties, and litigation. So once again, we're considering the sort of language and the sort of things that executives and management are interested in when we're talking about the consequences here to make them understand that those things are impacted. This isn't some abstract risk that they don't need to worry about. If nothing was done about this and confidential data was disclosed, then these are the areas that would be hit. These are the areas that these people are responsible for within the company. So it is their business to make sure that this does not happen. Then the recommendations to reduce this risk include role-based access control, including multi-factor authentication and least privilege. Role-based access control being understanding what someone needs to do for their job and just giving them access to the bare minimum. Multi-factor authentication makes it more difficult for someone to compromise an account if they guess a password, for example. They then need, of course, the authenticator app on someone's phone. They need the person's phone to receive a text message. Whatever the form of multi-factor authentication that's in use, it makes it harder for the account to be compromised in the first place. Least privilege is the idea that you only give people access to what they absolutely need for their job. Similar to role-based access control, but it also means things like if someone with high level access, like an administrator account, is just doing regular tasks that don't require that access to do most of what they do, they can have a separate account, more like a normal standard user account for doing most of their activities. And when they need to do important administrator tasks, only then do they use their administrator account. So for their role, they need high level access, but they don't necessarily need to use that account all the time. They can have a separate account for low level stuff and a privileged account for high level stuff when they need to do that. We're also recommending that they look at onboarding, offboarding, and change of job role processes to ensure that when people are brought in, they're given the right access, the bare minimum that they need. When they leave a company, offboarding, you remove their access immediately. When they're changing their job within the company, that you assess what they really need to retain access to, what they need access to for the new job, and what they should lose access to because they no longer need it for the new role. And then we need regular access reviews, especially for privileged accounts, just to make sure that nothing slipped through the gaps here, to make sure that these processes were done properly, to make sure that we catch something later if we didn't do it properly when we were initially onboarding the person, when they were changing their job role. It's just an extra layer of defense in terms of access control. So these two areas for me are the big areas where CTL needs to focus on understanding their risk and implementing the recommended controls to reduce their risk in these two critical areas. Like when you summarize anything, if you try to give too much information, then it's not really a summary. So in this case, I've limited myself just to these two. In terms of recommendations, I generally aim for 2, 3, 4, the most important things you can do. For the findings, 2, 3, maybe 4 is a good number. A handful without being too many. If we then go down to our next section, the risk summary table, we filled this out in the previous video when we determined the risk ratings. Once we had those risk ratings, we could then fill in this section of the table. This is also intended, especially through the color coding, just to give people an idea of what the risks are and how bad the risks could be, as well as what the situation would be if our recommended controls were put into place. If people did want to read into the particular details of this risk, for example, incident response, they wonder why it's very high, they can, of course, go and look at that particular risk. This is just meant to give, again, an idea to people who don't necessarily have the time or the inclination to read through your whole report from the beginning. They can just go and dive into the areas in greater detail where they want to do that. Some readers of the report may be alarmed at some of these risks, at the risk ratings. This is why it's important that you have a good explanation to back these things up. It is possible that you have to do an in-depth discussion with the client about why their risk ratings are the way they are. We'll talk about this sort of thing in the next video where the client gives feedback. If we then go down to the inherent risk matrix, we filled this out in the previous video as well. This is also meant to give a quick visual representation of the risk. In the risk summary table, we just see the overall rating, but here people can then understand without going deeper into the report if a risk is very high, which is the bigger concern. In this particular case, it's because the impact is critical more than the likelihood, because the likelihood is only likely. So we've got this inherent risk matrix, and we've got the target risk matrix. In these 4 pages of our executive summary, we're really taking the rest of our report and delivering it very concisely. We have 1 page of text for people to read through. That's not unreasonable to ask people to read through 1 page to understand the report. And then we've got 3 visual aids that intuitively indicate through the color how bad things are. The placement of the risks on the risk matrices also intuitively informs people whether likelihood is more important or impact. And it's just an effective way to visually communicate things quickly and effectively, leaving the option open for a reader to go into greater detail elsewhere in the report if they want. The most important thing when writing the executive summary is to make sure you use formal business language. You don't want to use conversational language, but also to make sure that you don't use overly technical language. To talk about things that business executives and directors, people like that, worry about and are concerned about when they're doing their job, when they're running the business, highlighting how these risks that we found impact those things so that they can then see how they would face difficulty doing their job, running the business, whatever it is, if they do not address these risks. All right, so we have now concisely communicated the key aspects of our report through the executive summary section. In the next and final video, we will finish our report by reviewing it, sending it to the client for their feedback, then issuing the final version. This also means we've almost completed the first stage of the GRC lifecycle. Let me know in the comments, what do you think is the most important thing to include in the executive summary of a cybersecurity risk assessment?